Welcome to the Underline This podcast, the podcast where we unpack the big ideas hiding in the margins, because the best parts, they're between the lines. This is going to be the best podcast episode to date. We're going to unpack The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Now, this is one of the most analyzed books for its depth and dive into the psychology of madness, critiques on the horrors of that era and the dark side of mankind, thus the name, The Heart of Darkness. And really, the title says it all and acts as a warning shot for the reader. Now, this is a heavy book worth reading, but if you take your time, it really is like the Mona Lisa in the literary world. It would be easy to plow through it, but I'll share a metaphor that I've given a lot in past episodes, which is that reading classical books is kind of like eating at a Michelin star restaurant. You could show up, you could eat your meal quickly and get out, but if you take your time and you actually enjoy it, you will find that there are a lot of really good, amazing details, and it is an enjoyable experience. Just to add more to that metaphor, a few years back for our anniversary, we went to a restaurant and I ordered a dessert, which ended up being a chocolate-covered skull. Was a skull, which was made out of chocolate but looked like metal, and they'd poured some sort of liquid, alcohol I assume, and lit it on fire. And when it got to me, I was amazed by how impressive it was, but I had no idea how to eat it. I mean, the thing was on fire, and I assumed I would eat the chocolate eventually. And so I looked at the waitress as this thing was up in flames. I said, "What do I do with this?" And she basically took a spoon, hit the skull, and it came undone. And on the inside, there was a chocolate mousse cake. So this book is very similar to that in the sense that imagine that it's like this hot chocolate skull, and we've heard good things about it. We know it's amazing, but I'm going to help you appreciate it, and we'll unpack it, kind of like unpacking that skull with the chocolate mousse cake in the center. So this is going to be probably the most thorough review that I've done to date. I'll provide a summary of the book. We'll provide what I believe are necessary historical context, and we'll give a background on Joseph Conrad, look at key themes, symbolism, legacy, and takeaways. So without further ado, let's jump in, starting out with a summary of the book. The Heart of Darkness came out in 1899, and it's a novel following a sailor named Charles Marlow, who recounts his journey up the Congo River as a steamboat captain for the Belgian Trading Company. Along the way, he witnesses the extreme brutality and exploitation of imperialism and colonialism, and really the moral corruption caused by imperialism and the devastating effects it has on both the colonizers and the colonized. And as Marlow is traveling up the Congo River, he meets with a trader named Kurtz, who has gained a godlike reputation among the locals. And when Marlow finally meets Kurtz, it's revealed that he is a broken man, consumed by greed, power, and has gone completely mad. There's towards the end of the book, he has his famous last words where he says, the horror, capturing the destructive consequences of really unchecked human ambition and moral decay. And really, that is all he has to say. And one can assume, again, it's open to interpretation, that he is saying the horror, when he is realizing what he has done and what is going on, and his effect on the local people. I mentioned that I think this book, it's necessary to understand the historical context of what was going on at that time and in this part of the world. So I'm going to give you a deep dive of history of the Congo before and after imperialism. So let's talk about pre-European colonization. And again, this is going to be a narrow scope to the Congo itself. So the Congo Basin is also known as being one of the most fertile and resource-rich areas of Africa. And it's home to many ethnic groups such as the Congo, the Luba, Lunda, the Kuba, and smaller riverine communities. And these societies historically have had complex political systems, trade networks, and cultural traditions long before Europeans arrived. Now, there's the Kingdom of the Congo, which lasted from the 14th and 19th centuries, and was highly organized with a monarchy, provinces, and tribute systems. It established trade with the Portuguese in the late 1400s, specifically focusing on ivory, copper, and sadly, they participated in the slave trade. And over centuries, it declined due to internal rivalries and European exploitation. Now let's talk about trade and contact before King Leopold. Now, King Leopold is a key figure here in this story and in this history. So from the 16th and 18th centuries, Europeans, specifically the English, French, Dutch, and Portuguese, traded with the Congo, specifically around the coast, mainly for, again, slaves and ivory. And the slave trade resulted in millions of Congolese who were taken through the Atlantic slave trade. And Europeans rarely, very rarely, ventured further inland. Most of the trade happened along the coast, which, again, that makes sense because the Congo, although beautiful and it is inhabited, there are a lot of, the environment is very different, I would say, compared to Europe. It could be the animal, could be the heat, could be diseases. And the inland kingdoms, like the Luba and Lunda, thrived by controlling the regional trade routes. And the trade that they profit off of would be things like ivory, copper, salt, and iron. All right, now going into the 19th century, there's a shift. And this is where we get closer to King Leopold of Belgium, but this is still before that. So there's the decline of the Atlantic slave trade. And by the mid-1800s, Britain and others pushed to abolish slavery. So demand shifted to more legitimate businesses around ivory and palm oil. You also had Arab Swahili traders from Zanzibar that would push inland, especially along the upper Congo River, trading ivory and slaves eastward. Then you also had exploration, where European explorers like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley began charting the Congo River in the mid-late 1800s, which revealed its wealth to Europe. That then resulted in the scramble for Africa. You had the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers met and divided Africa into colonies. King Leopold convinced them to let him personally control the Congo Free State, which, and again, not Belgium, claiming it would be a neutral free trade zone for humanitarian purposes. But the reality is that essentially became his private extraction empire. So before Leopold, just if we could summarize this all up into a few sentences, the Congo was a group of powerful kingdoms. It thrived through its trade networks and local governance. And Europeans really only interacted with the Congo pre-Leopold, mainly through coastal trade. And that was to extract and trade ivory and slaves. Now, right before Leopold, that's when the region was destabilized by slave raids, ivory demand, and of course, European exploration, revealing resources that were in the region. Now, we'll talk about Leopold's takeover. Leopold's takeover transformed the region with its own states and trade into one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. So let's talk about who King Leopold is. King Leopold II was the King of Belgium from 1835 to 1909. Actually, let me take that back. That was his lifespan, but you get my point. He was born in 1835 in Brussels. He's son of Belgium's first king, Leopold I, and became the king of the Belgians in 1865 and reigned until his death in 1909. And unlike other European monarchs, he wanted Belgium, which is a tiny country, to have overseas colonies to boost its prestige and wealth. Now, King Leopold was obsessed with colonial expansion and had ambitions to put a stake in the Congo. But Belgium's government wasn't interested in financing his colonial expansion there. So he pursued colonies personally, and in 1865, at the Berlin Conference, convinced European powers to let him control the Congo Free State, not as a Belgian colony, but as his private possession. And he promised humanitarian goals. So again, there's a facade of, and if you can see me, I'm doing air quotes here, to bring civilization, Christianity, and commerce. So that was the facade, when the dark reality was that it became the most brutal system of forced labor for rubber and ivory extraction. Now, there's a lot of atrocities that happened under his rule. So he enforced quotas through the Force Publique, a private army. Villagers were taken hostage. And if they failed to meet quotas, that led to mutilation. They would have their hands cut off. The term hobbled, if you ever heard anyone say, oh, looks like they're hobbling, where someone might have a limp. Hobbling actually was the punishment at that time, where if someone had tried to escape or didn't meet a quota, they would hobble them, which meant that they would quite literally physically disfigure them so that they couldn't run away, or it would essentially cause negative consequences on their lives, right? So cutting off an arm or a leg, or just breaking them. And millions died during this time from violence, disease, and famine, estimating around 10 million deaths between 1885 and 1908. So one would wonder, well, was King Leopold ever exposed for what he was doing? And we'll take a dive into that. So at first, Europe celebrated what appeared to be good intent. Again, when I say good intentions, the reality was far from the truth, but that's what King Leopold packaged this up as, was that this was a philanthropic, that he wanted to be a philanthropic monarch, and that his goal of going to the Congo was to civilize, again, to try and develop and make things better for the people, when really he had no interest in doing that. He wanted to profit off of them by any means necessary. So human rights activists like E.D. Morel and Roger Casement exposed the truth in the early 1900s, which sparked international outrage and forced Leopold to hand the Congo over to the Belgian government in 1908. It then became the Belgian Congo. Now, the legacy of this is that this is remembered as one of history's most brutal colonial rulers, King Leopold II. In Belgium, for decades, he was still honored as a, quote, builder king, and he commissioned monuments and urban projects in Brussels using Congo profits. Now, today, his legacy is hotly contested. Their statues of him have been defaced or removed due to recognition of the Congo atrocities. So, in short, King Leopold II turned the Congo into his personal empire for exploitation, and he falsely branded this as being some sort of humanitarian mission, but he left behind one of the bloodiest legacies of European imperialism. All right, there might be a little bit of redundancy, so I'll do my best to try and gloss over anything just to get to the point. But after, so let's talk about the Congo after King Leopold took over. And again, there might be some redundancies, but I'll do my best to try and gloss over that. But the Congo under the Belgian company in the 1890s was essentially a corporate-run slave state. Again, that was essentially a private enterprise for King Leopold II, and it was masked under the guise of civilization and progress. It represented the most extreme, exploitive form of imperialism, and it's exactly the system Conrad was critiquing through his novel. So, historical context for this book specifically is that in 1885, King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal control over the Congo Free State, not as a colony, but as a private possession. His claim was that he was going to try and civilize the area, but in reality, it just became a vast system of forced labor. And the company at that time was called the Belgian Company, and their operations were set up in the Congo. There's multiple companies actually backed by Leopold, which were focused on extracting rubber and ivory. And I mentioned before that the way that they would enforce these punishments and these quotas was through a private army of European officers and Congolese conscripts that forced locals to work and meet those quotas. And again, the atrocities from in the 1890s consisted of forced labor. And something that's really disgusting to me is that men were first to collect rubber, and if they didn't, their women were taken hostage to ensure compliance. You also had forced mutilations, where soldiers would cut off hands to prove bullets weren't wasted. You had famine and disease, so traditional farming collapsed because people were first forced to work for the companies, and the death toll estimated to be about 10 million. So the reason why I bring all this up and kind of wanted to give you to repeat things a little bit more is really just to understand why this is called the Heart of Darkness, because this is such an awful time in history, and that really this book goes into the center of it. So the conditions that Marlow in the story saw are actually what Joseph Conrad saw firsthand. And we'll talk about, I guess that's a good segue to talk about the author, but just something to keep in mind is that Marlow, our main character, almost like his critique of what was going on is very similar to what Joseph Conrad saw, because Joseph Conrad actually was employed by the Belgian company and traveled to the Congo. And so everything that he describes in these atrocities are things that he saw firsthand. And he used this novel to write and communicate, to give his critique. I'll unpack that a little bit more. But essentially what Conrad saw and what he communicates through the eyes of Marlow in Heart of Darkness is that you've got starving porters, which are collapsing under loads. You have native people who are chained, whipped, or left to die by the roadside. And there's the complete indifference of European agents who are enriching themselves while locals suffered. And this experience, as you can imagine, deeply shocked Joseph Conrad and was his driver into writing Heart of Darkness. Now, let's talk about Joseph Conrad, our author. Joseph Conrad was born in 1857 and passed away in 1924. He was born in Poland and spent much of his life as a sailor and later became a British novelist, which, if you read this book, you can tell that his English must have been amazing, much more sophisticated than mine, and this was not his first language. In 1890, he worked briefly for the Belgian company in the Congo, an experience that, again, would disturb anyone with a heart, and inspired his book. Now, his motives for writing Heart of Darkness was, again, to give a critique on European imperialism, especially the exploitation and hypocrisy of the so-called civilizing mission, and to explore the darkness within human nature when stripped of societal constraints. Now, to reflect his own disillusionment with colonial enterprises, having witnessed atrocities firsthand. So those are the motives for Joseph Conrad writing The Heart of Darkness. Now let's talk about the key themes. First, imperialism and colonialism. This book exposes the extreme violence, to reference a previous podcast, like the ultra violence that was going on there, and the greed and exploitation of colonial powers. It really is shocking to hear that there's justification to hurt other individuals and to not even imagine the pain and sadness that they must be feeling just for the name of profits. Again, I think that it's almost like a greed makes us blind, gives us tunnel vision where we're just looking at the profits, but we ignore the path to getting there. Next is the darkness of human nature. Now, this novel suggests that beneath civilization lies a primal destructive instinct. And unfortunately, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think history has shown that time and time again. And this also isn't a unique theme to this novel. There are other books that write about this as well. I mean, earlier we did Lord of the Flies in a podcast episode where we talked about that violent primal wiring that everyone has. And unfortunately, maybe in the right circumstances, we see a very ugly side of mankind. Next, we got civilization versus savagery. This challenges the belief that Europeans were, quote, civilized while Africans were savage, but that is not true. If you understand what epistemology is, and it's a pretty big word, so let me unpack that. Epistemology is essentially what knowledge is valuable to a culture. So, for example, if you're someone in Europe living in a city, there's information that's going to be more valuable to you because you live in a city versus someone who lives in the Congo, where they might value things like that are more applicable to them, such as hunting or maybe speaking multiple languages, essentially skills and information, knowledge, wisdom that you would need to live in that environment. So again, it's almost like it is a holier than thou, or more civilized than thou mentality. And I think that Joseph Conrad did a good job of capturing just kind of the disgusting way that people look down on other cultures in those circumstances. And when in the reality, it comes down to looking at epistemology, where yes, you might have a different culture or customs or way of life, but you can't use that to compare against others. So next, let's talk about madness and isolation. Kurtz embodies how power and isolation can corrode morality. It's interesting because Kurtz, we get some insight into who he is. He's clearly someone that's well-educated, influential. He's a strong businessman. But when you meet him, you realize that this is someone who is just ruined. They've gone mad with they've gotten quite mad. They are stripped of morality, and it just seems like when you there's a great niche quote, which is that, like, when you stare, and again, I'm paraphrasing here for those that actually look this up, but when you stare into the darkness long enough, you become the darkness. I think that quote is perfect to describe Kurtz. By committing atrocities, by living in evil that he is crafted and created, it's hard for that not to rub off on you and to whittle down your soul of all morality. And I think that Kurtz is that. He's someone that has created the darkness and he's become it. Next, you got moral ambiguity. So Marlow struggles with truth, lies, and whether meaning can ever be clear in a world full of contradictions. We'll go a little bit more into this, but when I talk about the moral ambiguity, it's, as Marlow's seen all this, you can imagine that anyone that's seen this firsthand who has a soul is probably questioning what's going on. But when it comes to the moral ambiguity, there's a scene towards the end where I mentioned earlier that Kurtz dies, but Marlow goes back to Kurtz's widow, and she's asking all these questions, and instead of telling her the truth, he lies. He talks about him being this man of, this intelligent man of business, this hero, and that's far from the truth. He's someone who is a monster, and even at times Marlow is terrified, but also amazed by what Kurtz has been able to accomplish. Because again, to the locals, he's become this god-like figure. But at the same time, when you're inflicting terror on the people and you have that kind of influence, there's a terrifying kind of respect that comes about. And when I say respect, I don't mean that necessarily in a positive way. I mean, it's the respect and compliance that comes from threatening people with real life nightmares. Now, let's talk about the symbolism, because there is tons of it in this book. First, we'll talk about the river Congo. The Congo River represents both a literal journey and a metaphorical descent into the human psyche. So as they travel further down the river, that's almost like the madness becomes more evident. Next, you've got darkness, which symbolizes evil, ignorance, and moral corruption, both in Africa and in Europe. And I would say that when we talk about the darkness, both in Africa and Europe, it's the evil and the greed that has corrupt these areas and caused these nightmares. Next, we got ivory, which represents wealth, greed, and the destructive force of colonial exploitation. It's shocking to me that just for this material, ivory, and again, if you're wondering what ivory was used for at the time, it was used for things like piano keys, and it was an exotic material to have, so it's also used for status. But it's just so shocking to me that in order to get ivory and rubber and literally just things used for manufacturing and making products, in the minds of the people at the time, and again, I'm not trying to be a presentist. When I say presentist, that means judging people based on the morals and values of today. It's just shocking to me that in order the goals at the end of obtaining ivory and rubber justified the means, and the means being, well, let's cut off people's arms and commit atrocities in order to get what we want. It's just shocking to me, which again, the novel, the title, The Heart of Darkness, I think is very fitting for this subject matter. All right, next we got Kurtz, who's a symbol of unchecked ambition, power, and the collapse of morality. So again, at this point, when they find Kurtz, he is someone that has become a monster. He is the heart of darkness, quite literally, and he is not the person who he was when he first went in. And I don't want to beat a dead horse here. Let's go on to the next one. Fog, which represents uncertainty, confusion, and lack of moral clarity. You may be now. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but I do want to talk about it. I'm really excited to watch a Apocalypse Now. Again, considered one of the best films out there. I think it's got like a 98% on Rotten Tomatoes, 92%. Either way, it's worth watching. And I want to talk about kind of the differences between The Heart of Darkness and the movie, because the most famous adaptation of Heart of Darkness is Apocalypse Now, which is directed by Francis Ford Coppola, who was inspired by the Vietnam War, or he used the Vietnam War as the context for The Heart of Darkness. So let's talk about the differences between the book and the movie. Now, the book, of course, takes place in the 19th century. Its setting is in the Belgian Congo during the height of European colonialism, and its focus is around European exploitation of Africa and the critique of imperialism. You've got Kurtz, who's an ivory trader who rules like a demigod. And then the themes here are around colonialism, psychological exploration, moral decay. Now, the film, Apocalypse Now, takes place in the 20th century in Vietnam. Now, the focus is U.S. military intervention and the madness of war. Kurtz is portrayed as a U.S. colonel who has gone rogue in Cambodia. And the themes here are the futility of war, the corruption of power, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. So the overall differences is that the novel critiques European colonialism in Africa, while the film critiques American military involvement in Vietnam. Both explore moral corruption, madness, and the darkness within humanity, but adapted to their own historical context. So I do think that that was a very well-executed modern adaptation for that time, because imperialism was on the decline, and instead what has kind of risen, or what has kind of replaced imperialism, is military intervention in other countries. All right, let's talk about some thought-provoking quotes that we found here. So the first one is, "There's a touch of death about a ship. Her crew always knows it." And this is a foreshadow of the decay and the inevitability of corruption, both literal and moral, especially as the ship is going up the Congo River into the heart of darkness. Next one. Let's see. Just going here. Lost my quote, so we'll keep with that. But let's talk about the legacy of The Heart of Darkness. So there's a lot. I mean, the legacy has a pretty wide net. It's known for being a seminal work of modernist literature, and really has left a profound and multifaceted legacy. And like I said, it explores colonialism, human nature, and it has impacted films that were made, culture and artistic adaptations, and it's probably one of the most discussed books out there. Not sure if it's number one, but it's also referenced as being a book that really does a thorough job of unpacking the dangers of kind of imperialism and colonialism. But my takeaways from this are that it's ambitious, it's sophisticated, it's psychological, and it really is like a black mirror of history during imperialism or colonialism at that time. It's a deep novel, one that I'll read over and over again. And the title sets a tone for a terrifying exploration into mankind at its absolute worst. There's greed, violence, dehumanization, hate, exploitation, torture, and death. And this story goes literally into the heart of it all. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please give us a follow on social media and wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.